Hi, y'all. Welcome back from Thanksgiving. I'm here again with Ruben to go through our market snapshot for this month. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything as we continue to do this every month going forward. So, Ruben, we're going to talk about NAR numbers and a few other things. What's the most important thing we're going to take away from today?
Yeah, so I think we're going to look at, the NAR statistics and understand that, we think housing market is close to like the bottom right now, right? We saw some pretty low home sales numbers last month. But then we've got some good news. Inflation data is looking up. We'll talk a little bit about that. And that's leading to mortgage rates starting to decline now. So we've got, a light at the end of the tunnel in a sense. And we can talk a little bit like what that means as we go into the new year.
Love it. So there's going to be some good news. Let's start with I wouldn't call it bad news. It's what we probably expected to be happening right now. What does NAR tell us happened in the month of October?
Yeah, so last month we saw, seasonally adjusted home sales fall to about 3.8 million sales. That was the lowest in over a decade, right?
Yeah.
Coming off another month that was also over a decade-long low. It was expected, right? Like we saw mortgage rates rise up to almost 8% in October.
Right.
They've since come down some. Surprisingly, home prices, though, were up again 3.5%.
Yeah, which is just a little crazy, right? We talk about this every time, and it still baffles me, and I'm sure baffles a lot of our viewers. We have low inventory, high mortgage rates. We sort of would expect that the high mortgage rates would also help put pressure on pricing. But as you said last time, Ruben, no matter how low our inventory is, if the amount of buyers for that same number of homes to be sold is still tight, we're going to continue to see prices rise. And that's really what we're still seeing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got like really low inventory levels. Even though mortgage rates were high, there was still enough demand to keep home prices rising. And we see a lot of regional variation there. If you look at the Gulf Coast, we're seeing closer to a balanced market. Home prices are either flat to declining. Some of them are slightly up, talking 2%. Closer to 5 months of inventory in most of those states, where if you look at the Northeast, you're talking sub 3 months, sub 4 months, and much larger price increases in 4 to 6% range in some places there right now. The Midwest is sort of in the middle between that, as well as in the West Coast is kind of a mix. But in general, it's just there's a lot of different markets out there right now because of the way these interest rates are affecting different places.
Sure. It makes sense, right? I mean, certain areas are going to have higher demand than others. Certain areas are affected or not affected by changes in the local economy, which we always want to remind people that real estate is a local business run by local professionals. And so if you're a real estate agent watching this right now, definitely be up on your numbers, understand what's happening in your local economy, and buyers and sellers should be talking to someone who understands those numbers, because no matter what we say about the sales, there's always the right time to buy the right piece of real estate. And Gary says that every time on stage, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. So knowing that we are where we are with inventory, with the number of sales, which trend down typically because of seasonality, right, Ruben?
Right.
We've got some other factors at play that are actually starting to look a little positive and might help us have a little happier outlook on what 2024 might be bringing us. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the biggest thing right now is obviously inflation. We've been talking about it for the last 2 years, and it's starting to get back into what we consider more normal levels. Like last month, they reported a 3.2% overall consumer price index level, right? What that basically means is like year over year prices compared to last year, 3.2%. Our goal is 2%, right? So we're getting pretty close. If you look at it less food and energy, right, that core number, we're still at like 4%, which is a little bit high, but that's a lot to do with like one specific factor, which is shelter. If you pull shelter, which is real estate in some extent, right, out of the mix, we're really very close to 2%. CPI less shelter right now is actually 1.5%, but that's got some of those energy price benefits baked into it from gas prices going down. Core would be in the mid 2s. So in reality, most inflation is where it needs to be, with the exception of shelter.
Gotcha. And so we talked about this last time too. Really, the rest of the economy seems to be doing pretty well, and inflation is coming down the way the government would like to see it come down. Except in our world, in the world of real estate as part of this shelter conversation. And part of that has been these pesky mortgage rates that we always talk about. What's happening with that, and how do we think that might affect things going forward?
Yeah, so the good news is that mortgage rates are coming down. We saw 10-year Treasury start to trend down in the last couple months. That's good news. It was basically a reaction to, the lower inflation data, the fact that the Fed chose not to raise rates in November, and we don't think they're going to raise them in December either. So that's good news, and it's a good news that the market reacted that way. There was a lot of uncertainty over whether long-term rates like mortgage rates and Treasury rates were actually trend down if we saw good inflation numbers, and they did. So that helps us kind of, as we look forward in the future, anticipate that as those numbers continue to improve, we can expect to see some continued decline in those rates. Right? We saw, last month rates peaked right around 8%.
Right. Yeah.
We're already back down to about 7.25% right now, which is,
much better.
Much better. And we think we could be getting close, back into the sixes potentially as we move forward, which would be excellent. The Fed's in a tough place because they've got like a weird catch-22 with inflation. We talked about that shelter figure, but when you think about how real estate fits into that, they're looking at like these monthly numbers they call like owner equivalent rent and then actual rents paid by people. Well, high interest rates don't make rents go down typically.
Right.
And the owner equivalent rent is a little bit of a weird thing because you're looking at like what people would be paying to rent the house they live in, not what they actually pay on their mortgage rates. So chances are right now, given what mortgage rates were when everyone refinanced over the last couple of years, that number is actually probably lower than what we're measuring. So there's a strong argument that like inflation's much closer than we really think it is to the goal, which is good because it's going to stop the Fed from, increasing rates further. But it also supports the argument that like the Fed could maybe do something to help the housing market out a little bit.
Yeah.
So we'll see. That conversation I think is going to be ongoing. We talked about, in a previous video, the letter that NAR sent asking them to intervene. There's a little bit more conversation about that kind of thing happening now. So as we move forward, we'll see if like that keeps coming up.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, Ruben, bringing back a conversation we also had a few months back, we showed a pie graph which stated that the majority of folks out there have these 3 to 4% mortgages, and only a small amount of the mortgages out there are above that 6% rate. And so what you're saying is that the information might be a little bit skewed the way that we typically measure because of how drastically different our mortgage rates were just a year and a half ago, which makes sense, right? And hopefully it sounds like there's, as you said, light at the end of the tunnel, that there are some things moving in the right direction to help our industry as a whole start to also move in a little bit different direction as far as sales go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think like the big story right now is a lot of the pressure that was pushing mortgage rates up seems to be dissipating. We don't know how long it's going to take them to come down or how far they're going to come down, but we know that like things seem to at least be normalizing right now, and we've seen them start to decline, which is good news all around for our industry. Yeah,
great news. So what we'll be looking out for is continued pressure on mortgage rates. We're going to look out for what's happening in our local inventory, and that's really going to help inform us on where prices might go. But one of the key questions that we get asked all the time, Ruben, and I'm sure most of the real estate professionals out there get this question as well, and that is, I'm waiting, or I think that prices are going to drop. What would you say to that?
I think that would be like a challenging strategy right now, because right now we've already seen prices turn positive again with 8% mortgage rates, right?
Right.
Inventory right now is low. There's not any evidence that there's any large amounts of building or anything that's going to come on that would push prices back down. So if we see mortgage rates starting to decline, prices are already positive. There's not a lot of scenarios that end in, a 15 to 20% reduction in home prices in the U.S., aside from some kind of massive downturn in the economy, which we don't see a lot of evidence right now. We've seen the labor market and unemployment start to kind of show a few signs of like loosening, but for the most part, we're still at historically low levels of unemployment in the country, right?
Right.
So there's really not a lot of signs that we're on the precipice of something that's going to push prices down that way. Now, stuff happens, right? Like it's always possible there's some black swan event lurking out there that could push us into some kind of severe recession. But I think banking on that as your home buying strategy is probably not a great plan.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that. I'm sure a lot of the real estate professionals out there appreciate you saying that, because this is a big question that's happening in the minds of the consumer right now. And we just have to understand, and why we do this market snapshot is that so people understand how to analyze and look at the data that's out there for us. And what I'm hearing you say is that it is definitely not showing us any picture other than we will continue to see prices potentially increase, because they've been increasing since July over last year's. And we're not seeing any reduction in that inventory shortage, because builders aren't building as much as we'd hoped they would be. So people should buy the right piece of real estate if it's the right piece of real estate for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Ruben, this was really fantastic information and hopefully very helpful as people are making a big decision about their real estate wants and needs. So if this was helpful to you, make sure you join us next month for another Market Snapshot. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss anything as we come back next month and talk about what the Fed does with interest rates.